The time has come to bind this character to his skeleton. So in order to do that, I'm going to go into the outliner here and into our character dwarf hero folder that we made and select the mesh itself. And then I'm going to go down into our rig group and find the root joint and control select that. Next, I'm going to make sure I'm in the rigging toolset by selecting rigging in this dropdown and go over to the skin toolset right here. And in here right on the top, we'll find again the bind skin tool. And we're going to go into those options. The default settings in here worked really great for our example before with the noodle, but because the dwarf hero model is a lot more complex and it involves a lot more working pieces, we want to change one option here to make things a little easier for us. That option is the binding method, and right now you see we have it set to closest distance. So if we drop this down, we see there's a couple options here. The one I recommend is a new one, I believe, called Geodesic Voxel. So we'll click that and we'll have that set. After selecting that, you may notice there's a couple extra options down here that appeared. And one is the resolution here, and we also get a checkbox for validate voxel state. The one thing you may be interested in is the resolution here. And depending on how complicated your model is or how detailed you want this bind to be, you can up this resolution. But the default is fine. I've never had any trouble with that. So I think with this particular character, we'll be okay with 256 resolution. The validate voxel state checkbox, I believe, is a diagnostic tool. So if you want to do a bind skin and look at the diagnostics afterwards to check to make sure if everything bound correctly, if you have a more complicated model or something, I think that's more of an advanced tool. We can have that checked off probably. I don't think that's going to add anything for us. The one thing to note about Geodesic Voxel is that it does take a little extra time. It's not too bad, but it's definitely a lot slower than the closest distance that it was set to before. And before we actually bind the skin, there is one extra thing I want you to check off, and that is the remove unused influences checkbox. And that's sort of like a little cleanup in case there are some areas that don't need any influences in your mesh. But I feel like we put the joints there, so we expect there to be influences set. So I generally turn this off. And with that, we're ready. We can hit bind skin. And just as a side note, if you were curious, apply will apply the tool without closing this box, and binding skin will apply the tool and close the box. So just in case you're wondering about those two options. We're just going to go ahead and bind skin. We don't need to go back into the options. So I'm going to click that. We're going to wait a second, and it's binding to the character. And depending on the speed of your computer, it'll take longer or slower. So here we are. Now we have our character mesh bound to the skeleton. And we can test that really quick by grabbing one of his hands and giving him a little movement here. With the mesh bound to the skeleton, we get a lot more visual feedback for how our rig is acting. So it's good at this point to kind of grab these controllers again and move them around and see and make sure everything is controlling properly. And by doing this, we also get an idea of where we're having issues and where we're going to need to be applying a little extra attention when we start painting the weights ourselves. Because the bind itself does a pretty good job by default by making sure that the skin follows our joints. But as you can see, there's a lot of clipping issues, and some of the parts of the mesh are being dragged with some joints that we actually don't really want. So it's good to check to make sure all that stuff is in order and that we're mentally prepared for that later on down the line. And speak of the devil, there's actually an issue here with the hierarchy. If you remember, I had these controllers set up in a specific relationship so that when you moved the clavicle, the hand would follow. But I never thought to do the shoulder pads. And I think the shoulder pads should follow the shoulder, don't you? Right now, I believe they're following this center joint that we have, which looks fine when you do this. But when we go to have him reach forward with the clavicle, we don't want to have to manually control the shoulder pad. It should just move with it. So I'm going to fix that right now. All we have to do is reparent this shoulder pad controller. So I'm going to select the shoulder pad first, and then I'm going to shift select the clavicle, which I want to be the new parent of this controller. And then all I have to do is hit P, and that should reorganize itself in the hierarchy. So now when I move that clavicle, that shoulder pad is going to go right along with it. And we can do it to the other side as well, where the actual shoulder pad is. Select the shoulder pad controller, select the clavicle, press P. And now we've rearranged our hierarchy a little bit. And that makes more sense, doesn't it? And still, when he bends over, because the clavicle controllers are following the center controller, everything below that in the hierarchy is going to follow. So our shoulder pads and our hands and the head and everything else. So now I'm just going to continue on with checking these various controllers and making sure they're all moving the way that I would expect. And now that I have this extra feedback with the mesh bound to the skeleton, I can better detect if anything's going wrong. But for the most part, it looks like everything is looking pretty good. I don't see any real issues right now. If there were issues with, let's say, the pivot point, like imagine if this pivot point was in the wrong area and I went to move it, the geometry would look like it was rotating on another axis. So actually a better example would be like the head. If that was on the wrong pivot point and I moved it, it would be easy to tell if that was not rotating at a normal, natural location, but on a funny location. So in order to fix that, we'd actually have to disconnect the constraint, move the pivot point, and then reconnect the constraint. Because if we try moving it now with it constrained to the skeleton, I'll try right now, I'll hold D and V. Imagine I want to move this pivot point to the shoulder. It's just going to drag that joint along with it, and that's no fun. So this all is looking pretty good, but we want to remember that we're also going to be animating these fingers at some point. So I want to check those as well. And just to test them, I'm just going to grab each one, starting from the knuckle, and give them a rotate along this axis here. And that way I can kind of see the general movement that we're going to get and see whether or not it looks accurate. So it looks pretty good. We're getting a little movement on his knuckles up here, on this armor up here. And that's something we'll want to sort out when we start painting weights. But as far as the fingers are concerned, this geodesic voxel bind did a pretty good job of making sure none of those finger joints are interacting with other fingers. So we're not getting the middle finger following this ring finger or the pinky finger following the ring finger. And yeah, that's why I recommend the geodesic voxel bind when we start, because it does a pretty good job at analyzing our mesh and binding everything in an intelligent way. So as far as I can tell, everything looks pretty good. If there are any issues, we'll address them as they come. But for now, I think we're more than ready to get started with painting our skin weights and making sure that this character is deforming properly and not doing weird stuff like this here.